Hello, it is me, Amy. I am back with another essay, and this one is extra super special because it's a collab essay. And after I'm done reading it to you, I have a panel to discuss with my co author, Jolie, aka All Hail the Night's Queen, and Archmaester Emma and Crowfood's daughter. So stick around for that. Let's go ahead and get into this essay. So, this is called Werewood of a Different Shade The Hammer of the Waters and Spreading Corruption by me and All Hail the Night's Queen. So this collaboration essay is inspired by All Hail the Night's Queen's theory video, and please see her original video. The link is in the description. I want to credit All Hail the Night's Queen for the main ideas in this essay, and especially those ideas pertaining to the Hammer of the Waters. And we would both like to thank Crowfood's daughter and Archmaester Emma for their invaluable contributions to this essay. Of course, all links in our description to their content. Please check them out. So there have been many discussions in the fandom about the shade of the evening trees. And while we learn much about werewood trees through Westerosi POVs such as Bran Stark and Theon Greyjoy, we get significantly less information about the shade of the evening trees in Essos. For this, our main sources are Daenerys Targaryen's POV chapters and what we learn about Euron Greyjoy through various Iron Islander POVs. But what are they? How do they relate to the werewood trees? What is their role in this series and on Planetos at large? We will argue that the shade of the evening trees are in fact corrupted werewood trees, and that that those who are wedded to these trees become corrupted green seers. Furthermore, we argue that the contamination of the shade of the evening trees was spreading from eastern Essos westward toward the end of the great empire of the dawn. And this is what sparked the mass migration of the Thirst Men and other peoples. Ultimately, we also think that the Hammer of the Waters was not enacted to prevent the immigration of the First Men, who were already a substantial population in Westeros at that point, but rather the Hammer of the Waters was a proactive measure by the Children of the Forest to stop this spreading contamination from infecting their werewood trees. So this section is called Corruption and Mass Migration, the Blackstone and the Bloodstone Emperor. The Empire of the Dawn was shaken to its core, essentially ended due to a celestial event. Meteorites fell from the sky, causing mass destruction and, as we will argue, mass ecological corruption. This event is remembered in the Carthene myth of a second moon that exploded and sent dragons falling to the earth. The association between dragons and fire has allowed many fans to make the conclusion that this is the oral history of falling meteors. One of the other stories we have from this event is the Bloodstone Emperor. He shunned the gods of the great empire of the dawn and began to worship the black stone that had fallen from the sky. We argue that this stone began to corrupt the earth and further corrupt the Bloodstone Emperor. He killed his sister, the Amethyst Empress, and many theorize that this ushered in the Long Night. Some also have argued that the Bloodstone Emperor killing his sister is Azor Ahai killing Nissa Nissa, and while Azor Ahai is considered a savior figure in Rolorism, he could have been responsible for bringing about the Long Night. The Bloodstone Emperor was already a corrupt ruler that was obsessed with gaining power and worshiping the Black Stone. And because of his worship of the stone, he founded the Church of Starry Wisdom. We think that his tyrannical reign, in addition to the spreading corruption caused by the meteorites, caused mass migration to the west. And the fall of the great empire of the dawn, causing mass migration, is comparable to real world history. For example, when Europeans migrated due to the Hun invasion. So during the Long Night, the corruption manifested in multiple ways, many of which can still be observed in the current Song of Ice and Fire timeline. First, there is Asshai. Due to its size and the water surrounding it being called the Saffron Straits, we can see that it was once a flourishing urban trading center. In the current timeline, however, it is sparsely populated, the water is poisoned, all aquatic, and animal life is deformed, the land is infertile, and there are no children, hinting at that the women themselves are also infertile. Asshai is also by the Shadow, and the Shadowlands could be ground zero for where some of these meteors hit. Many people in Asshai died after these space rocks hit land, and more starved. Some that did not die fled the city, and we see in the current timeline that it has started to become repopulated. But there are very few people there compared to the population at its height. While one could argue that the reason for the death of plant and animal life is that the sun was blocked during the Long Night, it does not explain the deformed animals, which hints at a magical reason. Another ruined city that could be a product of this corruption is the city of Inn and Sothoryos. When fleeing the Valyrian Empire, Queen Nymeria said that the city was ominous and evil, and that the forest would not grow into the city. Another sign of corruption is ghost grass, which the Dothraki believe will end the world when it spreads and nothing else will grow. The Dothraki are a product of the mass migration due to the spreading corruption and the tyrannical rule of the Bloodstone Emperor. The corruption from the black stone that fell from the sky killed the grass, turning it white. Part of the mass migration was some of the Jogos Nai going over the Bone Mountains via the Steel Road, later becoming the Dothraki. We see the similarities between the two cultures in their tribal organization, their plains lifestyle, reliance on horses, in the Jogos Nai case, Zorses, and their practice of following leaders based on their strength and not their birth. Because the Jogos Nai are the predecessors of the Dothraki, we argue that their Dothraki story of ghost grass comes from their ancestors who were fleeing the corruption that was taking over their grasslands. So, a space rock falling to the earth and causing corruption has literary precedence in an H.P. Lovecraft story. We know that Lovecraft, especially his horror elements, is a major influence on George R. R. Martin's writing. In the Lovecraft story, The Color Out of Space from 1927, the narrator discovers that a meteor crashed in Massachusetts years ago and corrupted all of the plant and animal life. This story is the science fiction version of a space rock that has negative effects on the Earth, and George R. R. Martin is creating a high fantasy version where the negative effects are magical rather than alien. So this next section is Shade of the Evening Trees and the Hammer of the Waters. Another manifestation of corruption is our main topic, the Shade of the Evening Trees. In her video on the Shade of the Evening Trees, Crowfood's daughter makes the connection between the werewood and Shade of the Evening Trees beyond a doubt, and argues that the Shade of the Evening Trees are another species of werewood. We, on the other hand, argue that the Shade of the Evening Trees are corrupted werewood trees. There is a race of forest people in Essos that are considered extinct, named the Ifaquevron, woodswalkers, in Dothraki. They are children of the forest or children of the forest-like people, and the Shade of the Evening Trees were their werewood trees. There are hints in the text that these two types of trees are connected. Bran eats werewood paste, and Dany drinks Shade of the Evening wine at the House of the Undying. And we see many similarities between these two scenes. Bran describes that the first few tastes of the werewood paste is bitter, but then it increasingly gets sweeter. Eventually, quote, "It tasted of honey, of new fallen snow, of pepper and cinnamon, and the last kiss his mother ever gave him." A Dance with Dragons, Bran 3. These are all innocent tastes with winter imagery, snow, pepper, and cinnamon. But when Dany drinks the Shade of the Evening wine at the House of the Undying, she also describes the first few tastes as tasting bad, and then eventually, quote, "She could feel tendrils spreading through her chest, like fingers of fire coiling around her heart. And on her tongue was a taste like honey and anise and cream, like mother's milk on Androgo's seed, like red meat and hot blood and molten gold. It was all the taste she had ever known, and none of them." A Clash of Kings, Daenerys 4. So Dany describes impure things with fiery imagery, right? We have fingers of fire and molten gold. Shade of the Evening wine and werewood paste are described as tasting similar. At first they taste awful, but then they taste like all the flavors that the consumer has experienced. They also both induce hallucinations and prophetic visions. There is further connection between the two trees with color dualism. George R. R. Martin enjoys paired color symbolism in the series, such as the black Night's Watch and the white others, the red Targaryens and the black Blackfires, or green Alicent Hightower and blacks, led by Rhaenyra Targaryen. With the werewood, it is white wood with red leaves, and the Shade of the Evening trees are black wood with blue leaves. The paired colors of each tree seems to be complementary, blue and black, red and white, further hinting at their relationship. But as with these other paired colors, they are not just complementary, but oppositional. Blue is a cool color representing ice, and red is warm, representing fire. We theorize that there were white and red werewood trees in Essos until the magical corruption created by the falling black stone turned them into Shade of the Evening trees. We think that these corrupted trees are where the first men got their fear of the werewood trees, and they most likely preemptively cut down healthy Essosi werewoods in their own homeland. Eventually, they did the same when they migrated to Westeros, afraid that the trees would become corrupted. It is said that the first men felt that the trees were spying on them, and we know that the werenet can be used by green seers to see beyond distance and time. The first men already had this suspicion before coming to Westeros, and they could have been worried about being spied on by the children of the forest. But they could also have been afraid of the Bloodstone Emperor, who may have entered the Shade of the Evening trees in order to enhance his power. The accepted narrative that the children of the forest severed the connection between Westeros and Essos with the Hammer of the Waters to stop invading first men. but it could have been so that they wanted to sever the connection between the roots of the trees and stopping the corruption within the werenet from spreading to the Western continent. We know that the first men eventually made a pact with the children of the forest and converted to their religion, adopting the werewood trees as religious symbols. We argue that the first men converted because the continents had been separated, and the first men no longer feared the werewood trees. In this way, the conversion of the first men was utilitarian and helped the two species unite to fight the spreading corruption. Next section is Euron and the Undying Ones, Shade of the Evening, and Corrupted Greenseers. The Dany chapter, where she goes to the House of the Undying, has a lot of Shade of the Evening and corruption symbolism. The House of the Undying is surrounded by a grove of Shade of the Evening trees, and Dany's mystical experience there is similar to Bran's experience at the Great Werewood Tree that Bloodraven has merged with. After Dany is given the Shade of the Evening wine, she goes on a vision quest, eventually ending up in the Chamber of the Undying. The door to the chamber is made of what she describes as ebony and werewood, just as the door of the House of Black and White. We argue that, like Arya and at the House of Black and White, Dany is actually seeing wood from the Shade of the Evening trees, but does not realize it. In the chamber, she is surrounded by robed men and women, described as blue shadows. There is a table in the center of the room, and above the table is, quote, a human heart, swollen and blue with corruption, yet still alive. It beat, a deep, ponderous throb of sound, yet still alive. There was no sound but the slow, deep beat of the rotting heart. This is from A Clash of Kings, Daenerys 4. We argue that this heart is an expression of the corruption of the SOC werenet. It is described as blue, like the leaves of the Shade of the Evening trees, and is literally described as being corrupted and rotting. Should the Heart of Winter prove to be an actual beating heart connected to the Westerosi werewoods, then this is the SOC counterpart to that, and this one has been corrupted. This corruption, in turn, contaminates the Greenseers, in this case, the Undying Ones. It is possible that the Heart of Winter in Westeros is also contaminated, a result of humans attempting to use the power of nature for their own selfish needs. As Archmaester Emma pointed out to us, the Undying Ones are associated heavily with werewood imagery. They grab Dany with twining fingers going through her hair. These twining fingers remind us of getting one's hair caught in branches. And Crowfood's daughter pointed out that they also go for one of her eyes. And this is reminiscent of Greenseer imagery, particularly when we compare it to Bloodraven in the cave with a werewood branch protruding from one eye. The Undying Ones are further associated with trees when they are described as having papery voices. And when Drogon sets them on fire, their flesh was crumbling parchment, their bones dry wood soaked in tallow. Tallow being made from animal fat gives the sense of this oily texture of the Shade of the Evening trees. And the reference to their bones has werewood imagery with the white bark. And there is further werewood symbolism when they are described as having blazing hands, a reference to the red leaves of the werewood trees. In A Clash of Kings, Theon describes the leaves of the werewoods as a blaze of flame from Theon 5. The Shade of the Evening wine also turns the drinker's lips blue. This is similar to the mouths of werewood trees that drip red. Hence, once again, we see color dualism and further hint that the Shade of the Evening trees are corrupted werewoods. Martin enjoys creating characters in the gray area, but there is one in particular that is bad, Euron. One aspect of Euron that is worth noting is that he's addicted to the Shade of the Evening wine. There are many theories that Euron being a failed protege of Bloodraven, evidenced by his dreams about flying that are similar to Bran's. It is possible that by drinking the Shade of the Evening, he is connected to the corrupted werewoods, a kind of foil to Bran's eating of the red werewood paste. In A Feast for Crows, Euron offers a minor character a lordship, and Victarion thinks, quote, "A king must needs be open-handed," he tried to tell himself. But another voice whispered, "Euron's gifts are poisoned." A Feast for Crows, The Reaver. In this context, gifts means presents or honors. But if we read gifts as meaning talents or abilities, then this line means that Euron's green-seeing gifts are tainted. Martin often likes using a word that means one thing when read on the surface, but then when read more deeply, has a double meaning. When Euron gives Victarion Shade of the Evening wine, Victarion describes it as, quote, "thick and oily, with the smell of rotted flesh," also Feast for Crows, The Reaver. And after a sip, Victarion asks if Euron means to poison him. Here again, we have the association with poison and rotting. and both Victarion and Dany describe the taste as foul. While Bran describes the weirwood paste as bitter, though not as bitter as acorn paste, the taste seems not nearly as disgusting as the Shade of the Evening wine. A drink made of nightshade and other substances is used in the training of the Unsullied. While nightshade is a poison, we think that George is making a pun here, as he often does, and is connecting this with the Shade of the Evening wine. Nightshade as a poison is also connected to the corruption that the Shade of the Evening trees represent. This concoction is called the wine of courage. They drink it with every meal, and eventually it dulls them to the point that they do not feel pain and therefore have no fear when going into battle. Martin's series has a decidedly negative stance against not being afraid. In A Game of Thrones, Ned Stark tells Bran that the only time someone can be brave is when they are afraid. That was from Bran 1. Being a mindless soldier without fear is also reminiscent of the others and the Whites. In A Storm of Swords, Bran 4, Bran remembers Old Nan's tales of the Night's King, who knew no fear. And Old Nan comments that this was the fault in him, for all men must know fear. There is another possible connection with poison when it comes to the Strangler, which is so dark purple that it looks black, similar to how the Shade of the Evening wine is so dark blue that it looks black. Ultimately, Shade of the Evening is being directly connected with poison and therefore with corruption. So an important question is, if the corruption theory is correct, why did it stop? It is possible that when the Long Night ended, the corruption ceased its spread and has become dormant. At that point, all of the trees in Essos were either Shade of the Evening trees or had been cut down before the corruption could spread. It is also possible that the corruption is spurred on by the darkness, and the lack of light that happened during the Long Night was what perpetuated the contamination. We can assume that during the second Long Night that the series is leading up to, we will see this corruption begin again, with the evidence being that the contamination of nature, such as ghost grass. We also predict that the corrupt green seers, such as Euron, will have an increasingly contaminating influence in the story, and their power will increase when the second Long Night begins. So that is the end of the essay, and I am extremely, extremely excited to bring in the panel, who are a bunch of lovely lady content creators who are killing it in the fandom. So we have my co-author, Jolie, aka All Hail the Night's Queen. We have Emma, Archmaester Emma, and we have Amanda, aka Crowfood's daughter. And Jolie has her own channel, All Hail the Night's Queen, on YouTube. Crowfood's daughter has The Disputed Lands, that's her channel on YouTube. And Archmaester Emma has a wonderful blog, Red Mice at Play. All of the links will be in the description. But let me just first, before we get into it, talk to Jolie about where you came up with this idea about the Hammer of the Waters not accepting this narrative that they were there, they did it because they wanted to stop the First Men from coming over. And then on top of that, where did this idea of corruption of the Shade of the Evening trees come from?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for writing this essay, offering to write this essay. The idea began that, like most people, I thought that the Hammer of the Waters, after a lot of the First Men already came over to Westeros, was a bit weird. Didn't really fit, because there were already a lot of First Men in Westeros, and I would imagine they would probably be able to make some boats to go to Westeros if they really wanted to. So yeah, it was always nagging me a bit that it wasn't, that I didn't think that what the Maester said in The World of Ice and Fire, that was correct. So, and my sister and I, we talk a lot about A Song of Ice and Fire, because my sister was one of the people that I knew would like that, and where I got my obsession with it from. So my sister and I were talking, and she was reading a book about trees, and her book about trees, this book, it's The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wolleben. he is a German forester, and he wrote about what he observed, how trees worked in nature. And if you have a natural forest, he describes that the roots of all those trees are connected with each other by some type of fungi, and they give messages to each other because they know when a tree within the network is sick. They know when a tree is contagious. So if it's sick and it's not contagious, they would, push nutrients that way to get the tree healthy again. But if they knew it was contagious, they could isolate that tree and just leave it to die by itself, and then the contagion wouldn't spread. And that only happens in natural forests. It's like that is not how planted forests work. So that got me thinking about the weirwood net and the hammer of the waters, because it reminded me of a tree network, just spotting corruption somewhere and isolating that. And I think maybe, like, with the help of the children of the forest, the weirwood net has managed to isolate itself to remain healthy and uncorrupted by the spreading that came from the east. So that was how I kind of figured it, where my brain went then. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And I know, Amanda, you've talked a lot about the WereNet, as we think of it, is actually much it covers much more land underground and even possibly into the sea, right? So do you want to talk a little bit about that, about this underground werewood net?
Yeah, so yeah, it's called the Pando theory. Actually, it's been around the fandom for a while, and some really smart people had figured out a long time ago that the werewood trees are probably connected in some form or fashion, and there's a lot of real life there's a few real life examples of trees that actually do this as well, not just with fungus, but there are trees that actually are all connected with a kind of like a network. And so people often refer to the werewoods as the weir net or the werewood net. And it is believed that the werewood trees are connected. Now, we do know that the shade of the evening trees are over there in Essos. And I do argue that the shade of the evening trees were once connected to the werewood trees. So it was all one big large net from Essos to Westeros. The children of the forest were there on both sides. So the trees were likely there on both sides as well, because the two are kind of go together like peanut butter and jelly. So peas and carrots. So they were probably connected. So we do see that there is definitely something that happened, a shift or a change. Something happened, something occurred. And was it the Ham of the Waters? I think it's actually a pretty good bet. There's a lot of stuff to deal with poison, with the poisoning of trees. One of the things that is almost instructive is the blackwood tree, and how the blackwood tree is poisoned with house blackwood. I think that that's also instructive. So anyway, yeah, I do believe that they were at one time all connected. And it's possible that this network is not just underground in the land, but it could actually be expansive under the ocean as well, because we do have continents on either side of the ocean. So this network could be incredibly large and encompass more parts of the planet than we actually realize. So yeah.
Yeah, and when we were talking about this, you also made a connection with these characters like Patchface and like Davos that drown, right?
Yes. Actually, if you go into some chapters and take a look at like some of the drownings, for example, like we have Patchface, who was drowned and mysteriously resurrected, we believe. It's probably a good bet. He didn't come back right, but he did come back prophetic. And I do believe that some sort of magic related to the children is the case. And there is a video on YouTube that actually does a good argument for that as well. It's by a creator called Alabaster, and it's spelled with a U at the end. So Alabaster. And check that out. It's called Patchface the Fallen Dreamer. And he makes a pretty good argument that Patchface may have had an experience that was similar to Bran in an instance, but he was more of a fallen dreamer. And when you take a look at Melisandre and her vision with Patchface and his mouth full of blood, it's interesting because that's very reminiscent of werewood imagery as well. So you have that. And there's not a lot of magics that actually give you that foresight. And werewood magic actually happens to be one of them. And then when you take a look at, for example, some throwaway lines like Makoro telling Victarion that his drowned god is no more than a thrall of the great other. But as we all know from like Melisandre, when she thinks that she sees the great other, she's actually seeing Bloodraven and Bran. For example, excuse me. So there's a connection that Melisandre is making when she sees like Bloodraven and Bran to the werewoods. And interestingly enough, we learned from the show that the children of the forest were connected to the creation of the others. So there may be something to that as well. So we have like Victarion telling, Makoro telling Victarion that the great other and the drowned god are somehow related. We also have things like Dunk, when he drowns, he sees something very, very intriguing right before he drowns, and he doesn't know what it is. And it's like long and snake-like. And it's interesting because there's a lot of emphasis put on that. And he's like, what was that? What was that? And it just mentions something white and long and snaking going by. And it's my theory that that was actually a werewood root, actually, believe it or not. And when Davos, when he drowns and he's miraculously saved and taken to the spears of the Merling King, he actually feels something very, very mysterious touching his leg. And for all intents and purposes, he probably did drown. And so how he survived is pretty much a mystery, kind of in the same respect how when Patchface drowned, it was much a mystery as well. Also, with the Ironborn, one of their most holy places is Naga's bones. Their most holiest places for their religion it's probably werewood. So there's that as well. There's a lot of hints throughout the series and I do believe that there is a connection to the two, meaning that there may actually be something under the sea, which is something else. And one of my friends from Westeros.org, who's also on Twitter, her name is Ravenous Reader. She has also identified something called an under the sea pun with green sea and green seeing. And so there's a lot of times where the author describes a green sea, and it can, again, when you mentioned that a statement can be taken two ways, one way at a surface level and one way at a much deeper level. And there's something of almost like a pun where green seeing and the sea are almost interconnected in a way that the author is like playing on again and again and again. And also with the trees being described as a sea. So it's taken both ways. So there's actually a lot to this. And if you want to check out, I think that Ravenous Reader has some stuff on Westeros.org that she does. Anyway, I do believe there's something to that. So yeah.
Yes, and the sea itself is a vast network, right, of different types of sea life. So that makes sense. And also, you were talking about these drownings. We also have Aeron Damphair, who was given the Shade of the Evening wine, and he has a vision of his dead brother. And he said, his brother asked, "What do you think is under the sea?" And he says, "The drowned god's watery halls." And he says, "No, worms." And worms, like snakes, long and skinny, right? He could be talking about these werewood roots. Emma, would you like to jump in?
It was just adding to the sort of green sea. We also have the Jade Sea, with jade predominantly being a green mineral. And the Jade Sea is right off Karth. Like, the gateway to the Jade Sea is Karth, which houses the Shade of the Evening trees. So it's quite interesting to me that you've got the sort of green sea right next to the Shade of the Evening trees, as if it's sort of like a big neon sign being like, these are connected, look harder. Yeah, that's.
And I wanted to jump in there because you were talking about the green sea and green seeing that pun, but it's also, if you look at the Catholic Church, they see themselves and the church as an organization and all that surrounds it. It's the Holy See. So it's also very connected to religion, I think. That it.
Yeah,
Totally,
and
that's great.
oh, sorry, go ahead, Emma.
I was just being like, yeah, that's great. That's exactly what. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also think, you know, with this, right, we're making this argument that there's a corruption going on. So, you know, I also we talked a lot about corrupted green seers. So specifically Euron, right? And also the Undying ones, which, I mean, the Undying chapter is a trip, right? It's kind of crazy. And this beating heart, you know, and it's called Rotting and Corrupted, right? And so kind of Jolie and I kind of wrote about how we think that just as Bran becomes wedded to the tree with weirwood paste, green seers can become wedded to the shade of the evening trees with the shade of the evening wine, but in doing so, they become corrupted green seers. So maybe we could expand a little bit more on that idea.
You go, Jolie. This is your thing.
Oh no, I was just thinking, you know, you hit the nail on the head. It's if you wed to a corrupted tree, you get corrupted. Because your source of power is corruption. So it totally would make sense that if, as I think, the weirwood, the shade of the evening trees are corrupted weirwood trees, then it stands to reason that only corruption can follow from that. So, yeah.
I also think there's a sort of interesting sort of thinking around sort of the weddings. There's a sort of consensuality to Bran's wedding of the weirwood tree, where like he chooses, like it's your choice whether, I mean, the choice is not much of one. It's like either wed the tree now or die with the whites, have fun. But he does still actively go through a process where he decides like this is the option for me. We don't know what Euron's starting point with the Shade of the Evening tree is, but we know that Dany is just, I want the knowledge, I must know what happens to me, like this is the way that I have to go because I'm like basically a messiah. I walked through the desert for however long. So there's a very different element to the way that they perceive the trees that they're having a relationship with. And that then ties into the way that the trees seem to treat the person. So Euron has become addicted to it. Like he cannot live without the tree, whereas there seems to be some kind of like the weirwood is sustaining Bloodraven in a very different way. Like it seems to be more of a mutually supportive like thing, as opposed to Euron's relationship with the Shade of the Evening tree, which seems to be really quite destructive and probably on an exceptionally grand scale.
Right, and we also have, right, like you were saying, this question of consent. Aeron Dampere and Victarion are just given the Shade of the Evening wine by Euron. He doesn't, you know, he forces it on them. Whereas Bran is like you were saying, Emma, given a choice, right? And he's told, not in so many words, but he's kind of told what he would gain from it and what he would have to sacrifice, right? Blood Raven had to sacrifice, basically becoming a semi-immortal tree being that can't move, but is then connected to the werenet, and that's the way that he can impose his will outside of himself, right? Whereas Euron, you know, he probably, when he became addicted, didn't quite realize what sacrifice would be involved in becoming wedded to the shade of the evening tree. So, and there's also something we've talked about, this wedded, right? There's also a little bit of a sexual aspect to it, right? We had Sarah Snow and I think it was Jace. They said that they made love in front of the weirwood trees, right? So there's, and you actually have weddings in the north in front of the weirwood trees, right? Kind of in the eyes of the old gods. So, you know, there's also this kind of idea of commitment to the trees, like one would have in a marriage.
One of the things that I did notice especially when we're talking to the aspect of humans' relationship with the two different sets of trees, is that we don't actually see any children of the forest, any Ifiquevron with the shade of the evening tree. And the Undying ones, which seem to be analogs for like almost like a nest of green seers in a sense, you know, they are human. And so it's interesting because it's almost as if the corruption might be the humans themselves in a way. And it's possible, because the Ifiquevron are believed to have been extinguished, it's possible that man's takeover of the shade of the evening tree, or of that of those magical trees, may have actually caused this corruption as well, or maybe been a part of it. Because when we look over in Westeros, Bloodraven is actually the only human that we see connected to the trees, whereas the rest are just singers. As Bran notes, he finds several nests of singers that he believes are dead, but you know, when he walks past them, he realizes that their eyes do open and they are still alive. So we do have that difference as well, where it's only humans over there in Essos versus what we see in Westeros, where we also have, you know, what appears to be the majority of the singers that are connected in that way. So there may be some human, like almost like a human involvement connection in there as well. And it was probably, I believe that there's a possibility that the humans were trying to take over the trees, and possibly that corruption was a result of that. I think it's a great metaphor for human involvement in a lot of things that should be left to nature. So
yeah, that's also kind of what I think, because I think that the Bloodstone Emperor being like a person, kind of like he is maybe godlike, but he is a person, and then him like being extra corrupted by that black stone that spreads corruption around, that he introduced that corruption into the weirwood net by entering it, maybe through, because he was married to a tiger woman, which I think is like kind of Children of the Forest like. So I think that the Bloodstone Emperor, with his greed, with his search for power, like, you know, like the big bad guy in Lord of the Rings, he desires power, and I think the people who get involved with it are the corrupted greenseers, also get like a desire for that power, for as much power as they can get, because I think that is what the Bloodstone Emperor, with his corrupted magical stone, introduced into the weirwood net in Essos.
Yeah, and we see in the current and former timeline on Planetos this kind of you know, kind of stripping of the land, right? The humans have this disrespect for the land. They look at it only for resources, whereas the children of the forest are stewards of the land, right? They're kind of like nature people. And so like the Western lands is being mined, and allegedly there used to be lions roaming, and hence the Lion of Lannister, and yet now they aren't there anymore. Right. And we have many other parts on the map that, you know, and there's also a question of why did the Andals leave? They could have stripped their land of all of its resources, and that's why they had to go find another one. It could have been also just imperialistic gain. They were interested in you know, the resources, right? And so I think that's a really big theme in Martin's world. I mean, and we also have a lot of people talk about how the White Walkers kind of represent climate change, right? Represent this this nature force that's kind of punishing humans, right, for not being stewards of the land like the children of the forest were. And so I think Amanda has a really good point about we don't see anyone except for humans being wedded to the tree in Essos, right? Whereas in Westeros, we know there are still children of the forest. So it might be that the reason that the werewood net in Westeros is still active and alive is because it has these stewards that are taking care of it, right? And also something interesting that I think we also can talk about is what is the purpose of green seeing, right? In the show, we kind of get, it's kind of like a library of human knowledge, and the green seers, you know, why is Bran, what is the purpose of these kinds of powers that Bran has, right? We don't really get it clearly in the show, except for he knows everything that ever happened and can see, you know, across space and time. But how is that? What is that for?
I think maybe, you know, maybe it's just also to show that nature looks at the world and time and all that stuff differently, that they are one continuous organism basically, and that they, like animals, know when there's a hurricane coming, like all that stuff, that nature just, you know, it feels that, it's got that, it knows, and it knows how to find a balance, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. It's a difficult one.
Yeah, it's a really odd one. That particular line from season 8, something about how the Night's King wants to destroy memory, really stood out to me. And I've been I've not written it up or got anywhere conclusive with it, but I have been sort of exploring the idea of memory as a potential mechanism of magic, because we know that the bones remember, with bones being connected to werewood trees and also being a means by which Melisandre can enforce her glamorizing magic upon Mance to make him look like Rattleshirt. Also specifically with Aeron, he thinks of memories as the bones of the soul, and those memories are him, the scream of the rusted hinge, as he is assaulted by Euron. So there seems to me to be something there, in that a lot of the time you do have memories being involved in the sort of creation of the last hero character. So when Theon undergoes his transformations, he sort of has this rise as a sort of villain character, where he's trying to acquire power and desperately fill the hole that Daddy left inside him, and then fails in that, becomes a very much like a whited other. He's the creature of Ramsay, who's very much an other figure. He then goes back to Winterfell, and he starts to remember who he is. And by remembering his name, he then goes on to be the last hero figure who rescues Jane from the tower, and will presumably in the Winds of Winter do something, I think, quite integral to the sort of downfall of the Boltons in the north. I think there's also Jaime when he's in the bathtub scene. So he's lost his hand, he's now become a broken man. I've got a bunch of essays about that. And he then sort of becomes this last hero figure. By remembering his name, he floated in heat in memory and reclaims his murder of Aerys as something that was a justified act to him, rather than something to sort of be ashamed of and to not have no one know about. So to me, that preservation of memory is something that George is associating with the sort of last hero character. Interestingly, in order for Daenerys to get access to the pureborn of Qarth, she has to make a sacrifice to the Temple of Memory. So that I think, but she's not being asked to remember anything. They're not asking, it's literally just a token sacrifice. So I think there's something potentially quite interesting there about how the Undying ones are not memories. They are, and Qarth is pretending to be a memory of something, but it's sort of whitewashing all the sins of the Great Empire of the Dawn, which presumably it came from, whitewashing all of those away and pretending it's the greatest city that ever was or ever will be. That was very long and rambly. I'm very sorry.
No, and we also have these phrases, the North remembers, right? And we also have, it's about vows, right? Brienne asks, Jaime, have you forgotten your vows that you made to Lady Catelyn? All right, and he says Catelyn is dead. I mean, we have Lady Stoneheart, so what is dead? Right? But there's this idea, he basically makes the argument, she's dead, so I don't have to remember. And Brienne is saying, no, you must remember. And Brienne is very much so a last hero figure in this case. And Jaime is a little bit more of the others imageries of I'll just forget and move on, right? And if the Night's King and his army of the undead do go out to wipe out the continent of Westeros, like hopefully that won't happen. But if that did happen, right, people would be forgotten, right? The memory of Westeros would, as it was, would be forgotten. So that's very much something going on there with memory.
So I actually have a quote here that I think is very, very pertinent. It is from Bran 3 of A Dance with Dragons. And Jojen is actually speaking to Bran, and he's telling Bran, they're talking about books, and Jojen says that a reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies, said Jojen. The man who never reads lives only one. The singers of the forest had no books, no ink, no parchment, no written language. Instead, they had the trees and the weirwoods above all. When they died, they went into the wood, into leaf and limb and root, and the trees remembered all their songs and spells, their histories and prayers, everything they knew about this world. Maesters will tell you that the weirwoods are sacred to the old gods. The singers believe they are the old gods. When singers die, they become part of that godhood. Bran's eyes widened. Are they going to kill me? So anyway, what I think is important, especially with the Children of the Forest, is basically all of their memories. And in a sense, the souls of everyone that has gone into that godhood. When we take a look at the Varamir Six Skins chapters, when he actually dies and he's searching for his second life, he actually goes into a tree for a while, which is very, very interesting, because we had previously only thought that like the singers or green seers could become part of that godhood. And we don't really see Varamir as a singer, just as a skin changer, but he does have those aspects of, with skin changing, with that Children of the Forest magic that, we see very, very connected, which is very, very interesting. So it's the memories of not just not just the singers, but the human green seers, and potentially even those that were just skin changers could be part of that godhood as well. So that's very, very interesting, because it is like a record. And when we take a look at when some of the libraries have been burnt, like the Library of Alexandria, and we see that as such an incredible travesty and a loss of all of this knowledge and educate, and of everything. And when that happens, we actually see almost like a civilization begin to like revert, because after a lot of the knowledge had been destroyed, when Rome was destroyed, they kind of went into like a dark ages kind of a thing. And we're actually kind of maybe see that again with the Citadel. Something very, very similar happened in George's world with Sarnor as well. They had a great library with the Sarnori, and that library had been burnt as well. So I almost see the destruction of the weirwoods as almost an analog to the destruction of knowledge the destruction of a people, and almost like an analog to like the burning of the library in Alexandria. And I think that we're going to see another example of that when Euron does his thing over in Old Town. So if the Bloodstone Emperor, for example, is like, if Euron is the Bloodstone Emperor like 2.0, then we might see almost like a interaction there with him destroying the Citadel as being maybe a metaphor for what the Bloodstone Emperor did to the weirwood trees, for example. And one thing that I do want to mention, because we're talking about green seeing, the green sight, the green men, all of this other stuff, and we're talking about the red trees, the white trees with the red leaves, and the black trees with the blue leaves. Now, you guys were talking about how you believe that the trees over in Essos were probably like the weirwood coloring. I'm wondering, because we see that the people that consume large amounts of that turn blue. I'm wondering if the leaves were originally green, if the leaves were originally a more natural color, because we have these stories of these people that are maybe associated with the weirwoods that I've discussed in other videos that were rumored to have been green. And then we have the green men on the Isle of Faces. And so I'm wondering if both sets of trees were maybe a more natural color before this everything had occurred. And we also have like the tall trees over in the Summer Isles that I think that I've mentioned before, and they seem to be something of a memory of the weirwoods as well, which is interesting because they almost use that as a library in that sense. So I potentially believe that before everything with the long night occurred, those trees might have been a more natural color. And when we take a look at the people that are consuming the weirwood paste, the weirwood paste is actually like a white color with like red veins. So you're not going to see a lot of coloring changes to the people that are like that, but because Bloodraven is like an albino, right? So you have that as well. And the other singers, their coloring isn't necessarily mentioned. It's the coloring that is mentioned with the singers that are not attached to the trees are the ones that Bran describes. And he said that they're like dappled like a doe. So I'm wondering if that coloring change that we see with the Undying actually occurs. Maybe they become paler, similar to the people that ingest large amounts of the shade of the evening. So it's possible that those green men that we hear talked about on the Isle of Faces were green for the same reasons that the people that drank the shade of the evening are blue, if that makes any sense. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And I've read a lot of theories about these kinds of different shades of skin. And, my blog is on Chinese literature and non-Western symbolism. So I'll give you, going back to the libraries, I'll give you the Eastern version of that. The Great Hanlin Library was burned in China, and we lost a lot of really good texts from that. And the first emperor of China, who is actually, I'm going to write an essay about comparing him to the Bloodstone Emperor. There's a famous scene where it was the burning of the books and the scholars. And so he basically, scholars were using Confucian texts to criticize him. And so scholars maybe argue that the burning of the actual scholars was an exaggeration, but definitely he burned the books. And so Euron is this first emperor of China kind of bloodstone figure who is erasing memory. And not only that, but he's stopping people like the maesters, the scholars of this world, from criticizing him and from kind of creating a kind of scholarly uprising, if you will, as much as scholars are able to get pitchforks, but this kind of these arguments against him, right? He's destroying their sources and the narratives that the maesters have created, which is what we get in Fire and Blood, which is their narrative of the Targaryen years, right?
Yeah, and also a couple of things with real world history, what you just mentioned. Having a lack of knowledge, a lack of where you came from and all that stuff, that really can destroy a culture. That it's a bad thing to have. And also, if you look at people, if they lose their memories, they are considered, you know, we can't, we have to care for them because they have no memories left. It's like you can't function in today's society without having a knowledge of where you came from, what you have. And that's also what they really did wrong with, you know, slavery. They took those people, they mixed them up, they erased their culture so they could, you know, enslave them. If they had like their own culture and their own knowledge and their own people around them, they could form an uprising. But if you destroy all that, the basis of people, of society, like the memory and their shared history, then you can, it's a bad thing. And you also, like, this is not real world, it's like with God and the Garden of Eden and the tree of knowledge, which you can't touch because, you know, knowledge is not good for people, according to God. So you have that. And then what, there was something else. Oh yeah, and I was thinking about, you know, the lip stains and all that stuff. It could also be like a symbolic thing of their corruption, that it stains, that it's like it's corrupting them, essentially. So I thought, yeah, that. Okay, sorry.
And also going back to this corrupted beating heart at the House of the Undying, something that I found interesting when I pulled that quote is that it says that it's rotted and corrupted and yet still alive. And yet they're called the Undying ones. So Martin's also doing something with life and death. And I mean, he's obsessed with it, right? You have the Undead Army, you have Lady Stoneheart. Spoiler alert, John's probably going to come back to some form of life, right? So this question of what is life and death, I think, is also working with this, because you have the green seers after they die entering the trees, so they aren't really dead.
Yeah, and I mean, building on that, like Daenerys, even when she's in there, she's like, are the Undying ones actually dead? Who would have thought? So that's, again, tying into that idea of, is this what is death? What is the nature of life and death? That kind of thing.
Exactly. And that beating heart is one of those things that a lot of people in the fandom have been like, what's up with this freaky beating heart that's on top of the, because they're like, is there really a beating heart, there that's like beating and, beating with corruption? And we have to remember that Daenerys in this scene is a pretty unreliable narrator because she has ingested hallucinogens. So chances are there probably wasn't an actual beating heart. This is something that was just kind of manifested to her. But I think that symbolically by the author, it's trying to it's basically kind of telling you what it is and what's going on, because with the weirwood trees, they are actually called heart trees. That's what they are. That's what they're literally called. And like when Arya goes to the house of black and white and she sees the weirwood and the ebony doors, she's like, oh, that reminds me of the heart tree in Winterfell. It's that. And so I believe that it's evocative, and it's trying to tie the two concepts together. So it's kind of trying to show the reader that heart concept. Now we see this like time and time again, these words like foul, corruption, spoiled. Those are all, pretty much the author is just like beating us over the head that something is not right. And when we take a look at how Bran actually describes the weirwood tree, he describes the paste as being bitter. And if you're familiar with and whereas Daenerys, her stuff is spoiled, like spoiled meat. Okay. So if you're familiar with eating some fresh picked fruits, the ones that have not fully ripened are more bitter than the ones that are fully ripe and ready to be picked. It's, and we have very, very pure words like a mother's kiss and new fallen snow, and all of these very, very pure words. Whereas Daenerys is given a lot of things that are very corrupt, like the association with gold. Gold is associated with greed, and molten gold is actually associated with kinslaying and her brother's death. So there's a lot of different things that tie these malign, spoiled, corrupted qualities to that shade of the evening tree, while we're given quite a few more pure, untouched aspects with the weirwood trees, and which has given us some lively discussions in the past, but when we're talking about Drogo seed. But anyway,
but the Drogo seed is quite important to mention, because as we were talking about earlier, the wedding aspect, there's this sexual aspect to the wedding of the tree, and so for her to taste like
Drogo seed. It's what it tastes like. So, but anyway, there's just
that's
a lot
salt
of
and salt and smoke.
Like the salt and
surprise
smoke.
plot twist ending.
That's what it was all along. That's the salt and smoke, and all the readers missed it. But so spoilers.
But I do think too, also we have Bran thinks of his mother's last kiss, but she thinks of mother's milk. And you would think those are kind of comparable, but her mother, thinking of her mother is tragic, because she didn't really get to know her mom, right? So she would have been, I would think, unless they had a wet nurse, which, even though Ares was dead at that point, they might have still had a wet nurse. But this mother's milk, this idea of kind of nurturing, but for Dany, that means loss, right? That means losing her mother and then losing her brother with the molten gold,
losing
right?
Losing her child, because Daenerys actually did make her milk came in after her child had died. Now her dragons in the scene where she actually hatches dragons from stone did drink it, but it is considered a very tragic thing for mothers who have to experience that, because it's a constant reminder of their loss. And it can be very, very painful as well whenever they're actually trying to kind of stop the milk flow. So because you get engorged, and it's just not great. And also for people that are experiencing that, a lot of the milk that does come out actually can, when it's on you, can actually be like a spoiled smell that you not nearly as foul, but there's definitely some. It's not always the best thing in the world, especially in the context of Daenerys herself.
Yeah, and sorry to bring it up again, but Drogo's stuff is also, she lost him, but it also is kind of her loss of innocence, because she was sold to the Dothraki. She was sold. She didn't want to. She was threatened that if you don't go with him, terrible things may happen to you. And so that the Drogo's stuff is it's also not like a pure memory or something. It's it has all types of different layers to it.
And there's also a question of consent,
the loss
right?
of
She was
Drogo
raped
to the loss of
essentially
her innocence
that first night. Yeah. And it was their first interactions were not consensual as well. And I know especially some men in the fandom try and paint over a lot of those scenes. It was rape. It was rape. Okay. And the Cersei and Jaime thing with her dead son right there, also rape. Screw you, D&D, for saying she was convinced mid-rape. Fuck that. I'm sorry, but really.
It was rape. It was rape. Just putting it out there.
Anyway, so it also, the Drogo seed is also associated with, going back to what we were talking about, consent, right? It's also a lack of consent on her part. And like you were saying, Jolie, this loss of innocence, she was 14, right? Yeah, and the brother who was supposed to protect her sold her off. So it's also a reminder of that kinslaying that a lot of people, including me, argue was justified.
It's also a sign of loss for her as well. So like in the last moments where she's desperately trying to bring back some, going back to the what is dead, what is life thing, when he's sort of catatonic and she's desperately trying to revive something of Drogo, she, quote, takes him in her mouth. So again, the taste of Drogo's seed being involved in this is also goes along with all of the other senses of a loss of someone but who you grieve for, but with that relationship itself being quite toxic again, like thinking of her abusive, like Viserys's abuse of her. She still grieves for him a bit, but he wasn't a healthy person for her to be around.
Yeah, I think that's pretty poignant, Emma. I do think that, especially at the end, that her relationship with Drogo was more of a tragedy to her, because she did grieve fiercely, but you do know that there was a lot of layers to her relationship, and I think that that's common, with people in general, that there's going to be some things that are remembered that you don't necessarily think fondly on. And then you're also going to have some very, very fond memories of that person. And it can go both ways with Daenerys. But I do think that when speaking in the context, going back to the actual stuff that we were talking about with the tasting experience with the Shade of the Evening Tree, there just seems to be a lot more corrupt things, spoiled, foul, just the language itself speaks to the nature of the stuff. Whereas with the weirwood, you do see that the things that are described that Bran mentions are a lot more pure than the things that Daenerys mentions. And it could be just the nature of the characters themselves. Bran is much more younger than, well, not much more. She's like 14 there, but she is younger. Bran is younger, and Daenerys is a little bit older, and she's had a lot more adult experiences than Bran has had at that point. So it could be, the author doing that in that respect, but just when taking everything in, when we talk about what the tasting experience with Aaron, it's similar wording. It's described as like foul. Victorian wonders if he's trying to poison him, and then we have that poisoning wordplay that we see with House Blackwood. We just see a lot of different connections there, which is pretty interesting. So.
Yeah, and like the weirwood net in Essos was poisoned by, I think, the Bloodstone Emperor with his magical black stone. So, I think, yeah, sorry.
And also the Dany quote, when she has the Shade of the Evening wine, she says it was all of the tastes and yet none of them. There's also this kind of emptiness that is hinted at, right? That it's a substance that you're drinking, but it's, in the end, it's an empty feeling, right? And we have Euron is addicted, and when you are addicted, you can never get enough, right? It's an empty feeling, and you're trying to fill yourself with something, and in doing so, you become dependent on that emptiness that drug provides, right?
So what do you think is going to happen to Euron when he runs out?
Oh my God.
Because he only so how much has he drank? He's drank enough to turn his lips blue, right? So, and I don't know if he's addicted just as much as he just really wants to continue having visions. I think that he's got a lot of plans and he wants to kind of see a lot of stuff to fruition. It's not, it could be addictive, because there's a lot of, similar wording, but he's about to run out. Because how many casts did he say he had out of Karth? I think it was like 2, right?
Yeah. And he could be addicted to the power that it gives, and that's still technically addiction. Yeah.
Exactly.
But yeah, a little nuanced. I see. Yeah, you're right. That's the question of, if he runs out, he won't have that. He will no longer be wedded to the tree, basically, right? Is kind of how it seems to go.
Mm-hmm. And he would essentially have a loss of power, which is the exact opposite of what he is trying to achieve as well in that sense. So that's also interesting. I've got some stuff that I'm working on, and I think that I know how he may be able to obtain some more. But it's interesting because he may run out. and that might be something too, especially if it is addictive in that sense. And it's kind of hard to tell, are the warlocks getting, the warlocks of Karth still getting the stuff? We don't really know.
We don't know how many warlocks are left after Danny burned down the House of the Undying.
Well, right now there's 2. So Pyat Pri and then the other, and there's a missing warlock because Euron, he mentions there being 4 warlocks. Danny also mentions there being 4 warlocks. Euron feeds 1 warlock to the other 2. So so there should be 3, but there's only 2 that show up in the galley to be sacrificed. So we are short 1 warlock, and we really don't know how many more there are because apparently there are some warlocks in Ashai as well. So, and there may be some throughout, Essos in different, like House of the Undying, like monasteries. You never know. But that's what we're given. So we know that there are those 2 plus 1 missing, potentially some in Ashai, and potentially some in more of the more magical and mysterious places over in Essos. So there's that. And one thing that I wanted to mention, because I think that there was mention about there being magic in a warlock's corpse. So let me see if I can find it. Nope, I'll find it some other time. I'll tell you guys about it later. But because Danny's, I think that Danny's actually given a whenever she's actually given a bunch of the gifts, she's given the body of, maybe it was just a magic practice, practitioner of magic, but she was like given the corpse of a practitioner of magic, and it was under the belief that they even the corpse held power. So
like in the Catholic Church, like the holy relics, they have like pieces of saints that have their power, like their power is embodied or integrated in that piece of person.
And there's an Eastern one as well. There was this in the 700s in China, someone claimed to have found the finger bone of the Buddha. And so that was paraded all through the land, and everyone came to worship to it, thinking that it had power, and it was buried under a pagoda, right? Which is also a religious symbol. So this idea that the magic or that the power is in the bones, right? Kind of also reminds me of the weirwood trees.
Yeah, and also in like in very like in different cultures, there is like in South America, you had like a people that carried their dead king for like 400 years into battle because they had like, yeah, our king is still here. You see, he's sitting on the chair, and that is also, they thought it would give power. But what I also wanted to say about the whole thing with the Nightshade and the corruption and the search for power, like Euron is searching for a lot of power because he wants to be a god, and the warlocks are searching for power, and it reminds me a lot of like the Ring of Power. They have a yearning for it, they are addicted to it, and if it leaves them, they are lost, totally lost. So I think it will be an issue with Euron, with the Nightshade, that he will be lost without it.
So I did find the quote. Okay, are you guys ready? It is Daenerys 3 of A Clash of Kings. It says, a widow brought the dried corpse of her husband covered with a crust of silvered leaves. Such remnants were believed to have great power, especially if the deceased had been a sorcerer, as this one had. So, and then the Tourmaline brother had given her a crown. So anyway, what Euron is doing with the warlocks is quite interesting, because those are essentially practitioners or sorcerers. So that's cool.
I think another
Wait,
option.
eats the other. Is it then extra, extra concentrated warlock power? Like if you all get one to eat everyone else, does he get more powerful then if you kill it?
I don't even know what he was doing there, what he was thinking. I think that he likes to do a lot of shock and awe. And I think that he gets a kick out of the depravity of some of the things that he forces on other people. Obviously he's done terrible things to Aeron, terrible things to his brothers. And it seems like a joke to him, which is just terrible, like, it just speaks to him as a person. So I don't know if there was something, especially magical that he was trying to accomplish, or if he was just trying to be a really sick individual, which I think is more of the case. I
was joking.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Well, you could take it that way, because there's a lot of messed up stuff in A Song of Ice and Fire, and there is a lot of cannibalism.
The fifth book is just all cannibalism.
It's all cannibalism.
And there are examples of tribes, I believe, in Polynesia that would eat the bodies of their enemies. And I believe the people on Skagos are said to do that, right, to absorb their power. So it's not completely unheard of, but I think you are right, Amanda, in that he's just being a crazy weirdo who is, like we say in the essay, he's really the only non-gray character that we get. Ares, we know before he was the Mad King, he's described as not necessarily being a bad guy. But there's usually people turn bad, but it seems like Euron came out of the womb bad.
I think another option for Euron and what he could do is if he takes Old Town, then it does have a half-dead werewood on the Isle of Ravens. So the half-dead aspect could potentially have this some kind of like frozen in time, half corrupted aspect, which Euron may like decide that he quite likes the half corrupted werewood net. So yeah.
Yeah, I think Euron likes that part because it gives him power. It gives him extra power. It makes him see stuff that hasn't maybe happened yet or has happened in the past. It is a source of power for him, and because he is like a Bloodstone Emperor type of dude. Like the Bloodstone Emperor, he had like the empire and he wanted more power. So Euron longs for power, and I think that is what corrupted the werewood net, like the black stone. It all symbolizes power to me. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
and by killing the Amethyst Empress, right? It was to because she was going to have the throne and he wanted it for himself, right? So he wanted this power, and because of that, he was willing to kill Kinsley, right? And we know that the old gods are against specifically it's kinslaying and going against guest right? And we were talking about this a little bit, and that maybe he killed the Amethyst Empress at her wedding. We don't know where exactly she was killed. And so it could be that the two things that the old gods hate the most comes from this Bloodstone Emperor, Amethyst Empress story.
Yeah, I think there's a very good chance that it has, because I think that, Amethyst Empress died sort of, but like the Maiden Made of Light fled, like turned her back to the world, went somewhere on walkabout, not there. And oh fuck, I lost it. Oh, remind me, please.
Remind you of the wedding and the possible and the death of the Amethyst Empress.
Yeah. No, I
I'm
lost
sorry,
it.
I'm not in your brain. I can't help. I can't help. You need the remember all to know that you've forgotten something.
Yeah, I remember that I've forgotten something. The only problem is I can't remember what I've forgotten. But yeah, with the wedding. And I think, that definitely influenced the old gods, because I think she is somewhere in the Weirwood nets. And I think that, like, their hatred of killing kin and betraying guest right is, I think it very well could be that the Amethyst Empress could be the source of that.
And so, and we can always go back to any of these subjects, but something that I was interested in and that Jolie and I talk about in the essay is this color symbolism and duality that Martin is very fond of. And so we have the fiery leaves, right? Red leaves of the weirwood tree, and then these cool blue leaves of the Shade of the Evening, right? Ice and Fire, it's in the series name, is Song of Ice and Fire. So, and then Jojen and Mira do this whole speech about if love and hate can mate, and ice can burn, right? And we were also, I believe, talking about, fire can also cleanse, right? And bring about new life. A forest burns down so that a new one may sprout. So what do we think that this ice, fire, blue and red symbolism is going on here?
I think it reminds me of yin and yang, because they both took something from each other, and because you associate like the black tree and the blue leaves, it's more like the long night, ice, and all that stuff, and you have like the white. The white tree with the fiery leaves, and that's like the dawn and the white light and all that stuff. So I think that is one of those things that, because I don't think it's like the fiery thing is only everything has to be fiery for it to represent the Bloodstone Emperor, the corruption, the lore. And I think that that it could be an inverse of what it actually symbolizes.
Yeah, and you mentioned yin and yang, which comes from Taoism, and Taoism has a very large suspicion, a very strong suspicion of dualism and of making two things separate and different and distinctly not at all similar. Whereas yin and yang is all about balance, right? You have to have the yin and have to have the yang. So even though you say that the yin is evil and the yang is sun and and unfortunately, because it's, traditional Chinese things, male, right? And that is the yang, and then the yin is female, shady, the moon versus the sun, right? But I think what Martin is doing here is showing that that both need to be in balance, right? Just as we don't want a winter that lasts forever with the long night, we also don't want what Garth Greenhand represented, which was a boundless summer that lasts forever and lots of children, right? And that's also unnatural. We want a balance, I think, is where this is going to.
Yeah, so I think there's also, like you guys are saying, the yin and the yang is very evident here. The coloring patterns are so complementary with one another. They are like almost mirror images, like completely inverse but completely parallel to one another. And I think there is an element of sort of, if we think of ice and fire rather than yin and yang, then in the center of each there should be fire within the ice and ice within the fire. And that is what George seems to be doing with the others who have their eyes that burn cold and burn like ice. So the others seem to represent a burning ice or a fiery ice. Whereas the Night's Watch seem to represent obsidian. You have a lot of obsidian related things associated with the Night's Watch, like the tokens that they cast their votes with. Or Brynden Blackfish Tully also has quite a lot of Night's Watch symbolism around him because he goes around constantly in black all the time and is committed to never marry. So certain things like that. And he has an obsidian blackfish on his as like a brooch. And obsidian is also known as frozen fire. So again, there you have your ice within the fire. And that is also paralleled in the drinks of, and the werewood paste is has red and has blood, but it tastes cold. Whereas the Shade of the Evening drink that Daenerys has, it looks cold, it's all your blues, it's presented on a silver platter out of a crystal glass. Crystal itself has a lot of ice imagery, but when she tastes it, it's hot. It's tendrils of fire around her heart. It is molten gold. So all this sort of hot language around something that should be cold, which sort of again gives you that burning ice versus frozen fire motif there as well. I tried to keep it succinct, but I can carry on if anyone wants me to go.
You carrying on about symbolism? Never, Emma, never. I was just waiting to give I was waiting if Amanda wanted to jump in. Yeah.
Oh no, I thought that everybody had some really good points. The only thing that I could potentially add to the conversation is that we see that all the way in the very first chapter of A Game of Thrones, in the prologue, where one of the characters states that nothing burns like the cold. So that concept is actually put forth right at the very beginning. So if it is put in the, right forth there in the very beginning of the entire series, it should be something to take note of. But I think that everybody put some, like, great points forward. So yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I'm just going to open it up if there's anything you guys want to touch on that we haven't already talked about, or maybe something in the essay that you want to elaborate on. The kind of free-flowing discussion, I kind of went down the list of all the things I wanted to talk about, and we're at the end of that list. So whatever you guys want to talk about more, doing with the WereNet, In the Shade of the Evening Trees, Corrupted Greenseers, how much of a jerk Euron is, whatever you guys want to do.
Well, I wanted to talk about again about the Hammer of the Waters, a bit about the mechanics, maybe, because when I was talking to you about this a while ago, I can't help but picture like the Last March of the Ents. That is like how they the roots went into like the stone and they ripped the things apart by with the roots. The roots were doing that, and I was thinking about if the green seers or the werewoods can move, or their roots like some trees can, but then in a magical way, like way more drastic, then they could have ripped like a small land bridge apart just by retracting roots from there and just taking the stone with it. So that's the only thing I really wanted to mention.
So I do think that at least under the sea, that if there are werewood roots underneath of it, I do think that they may actually have some mobility. I think that that is where the legend of the, where we have Kraken sightings actually come from. I have a, I have a headcanon that there are no actual like giant krakens roaming the sea, that it could actually be part of this werewood net. One of the things that can point you to that are a lot of the wordplay between krakens and trees, and also the sea stone chair, which is supposedly carved in the shape of a kraken, but it may actually be a petrified shade of the evening tree. There's also, if the Hammer of the Waters, if the children were associated with the Hammer of the Waters, and it did have something to do with the werewood net. What's interesting is that in one of the chapters, it's like an Arian, I think it's one of the Arian sample chapters, they mentioned there being krakens being seen off of the, broken arm of Dorn. So, and that's where the Hammer of the Waters had actually occurred. And it said that they were being drawn to blood, whereas that is what you use for sacrifices to the werewoods. So, so there's that. And like I said, there's something that touches Davos's legs. Dunk sees something when he gets drowned. The stuff with Patchface. I do think that there may actually be something to that, which is incredibly exciting for me, especially since, Euron is associated so much with that Shade of the Evening Drink, and he has something planned over there in Old Town with all those Eldritch Apocalypse theories that, I think that it was Port Quentin that had, first developed. It's possible that we may see, krakens, but I don't think that it's actually from a squid-like creature. It's from maybe Euron doing something with that. So I'm super excited about that. But
And like a popular theory for like the collapsing of the crypts under Winterfell is that the roots of the werewood tree are actually doing that. They're somehow like consuming the Starks that are buried in the crypts of Winterfell. So again, that would potentially tie into the ability of the werewood trees themselves to somehow like move the stone or move themselves into, enacting something in the real world.
Yeah, I would love that. I'm kind of bummed out that we're not going to see maybe real krakens, but I kind of love the whole werewood root theory, because I think they can independently move, and I think they like blood a lot. There's a lot of blood sacrifice for the werewoods, so that is their source of food, maybe. So they'll move towards that. They just like real plants would do. They'll move towards their source of food.
exactly. And in the House of the Undying, Daenerys is absolutely an unreliable narrator. And I tend to believe that what Daenerys actually sees instead of these enthroned and dying ones, and notice how the wording that's used there with the enthroned, which is the same way that Bran describes the green seers in the cave. I tend to think that what Daenerys is actually seeing is still unreliable when she does see the Undying ones, and that they may be in something more like a green seer cave in that respect. If you notice, Dany is continuously having to walk upstairs. So the Pyat Pri tells her, you know, always turn right and always go up the stairs, always turn right and always go up. So if you recall how the House of the Undying is actually described, it's described as a long and low building. So maybe one story, or, you know, maybe as many as 2 stories, but not more than that. Not more than that. And Dani remembers it being incredibly odd that she was going up so many stairs because she hadn't seen any towers. So that means that if she was continuously having to go upstairs, that means that she was continuing to descend down, which means that she was probably going underground, which she would not be able to notice because the House of the Undying is completely windowless. So there's that as well. So if she was underground and it was surrounded by shade of the evening trees, there is that possibility. And she mentions how the ground seemed to move under her feet. And she also mentioned, we see with the Undying ones, like them going for the eye, and that's the same place that the weirwood root chose for Bloodraven as well. And then we have all of that wood imagery and symbolism, wordplay with the Undying one. So yeah, I think that there's a possibility that, you know, they might be able to move. You never know. So
yeah, I actually never thought about that. Now next time I read the Undying chapter, I'm gonna kind of think of them as like being in it, like the weirwood cave that Bloodraven is in. I'm sorry, Emma, go ahead.
I was going to completely change the topic. So if you still want to like chat more about the sort of, it does fit into that sort of inverse thing as well. Like she's perceiving it as different, but it is actually the same sort of thing. Yeah, so I was going to mildly change the topic to, we mentioned that there wasn't really any kind of Children of the Forest analog really present there. But I just remembered there are the like dwarf peoples or the little people that are there. And they are consistently spoken of as having like quite ratty pointed faces. So could they potentially be some kind of corrupted Child of the Forest type peoples who, rather than stewarding the trees and stewarding nature, they are stewarding the humans of the shade of the evening who are ingesting the shade of the evening? There's no indication that they are in fact magical people. They could just be like some kind of,
you know, I did notice that.
yeah.
I noticed that as well. And that did run through my mind as well, which is something very interesting. And something that actually went through my mind in addition to that was actually the tale of the rat cook. Yeah, where his children were turned into rats, which if, you know, some people think that a lot of these different Night Fort stories are about, you know, the Night King, and the rat cook being one of them, which is interesting. Now, this is obviously completely apart in Essos, but if this is somehow related to the Night King, which it, you know, very, very speculative, then because it said that all of his children were turned into rats, that just like crossed my mind as a possibility. Other than that, I got nothing, but it did cross my mind.
Yeah, and it also reminds me of is it Gendel's children? That, you know, that they got lost in these labyrinth-like cave system. Kind of reminds me of the WereNet. That's also kind of a maze of roots, right? That are kind of going everywhere and would be very easy to, you know, just these caves are easy to get lost in, right? And they're so expansive. And something that Alicia Kingston and I have talked about is this idea that she believes that and I've seen this a lot in the fandom, that cave system goes all over Westeros, not just at the wall, just as we think that the WereNet goes all along Westeros, not just where there are weirwood trees, right? So we've talked about how the weirwoods do not rot, they turn to stone. So just because you cut down the weirwood, the roots would not rot. I would think they would just turn to stone, but they would still be there, right? And still be a part of the network.
Well, I think they could be still a part of the network, even if they turn to stone. When I was researching this, I was reading the intro to this book. He was talking about like that he saw some stones. He thought he saw some stones, and then with moss on them. And then when he removed the moss and he scraped it with his knife, there was a living tree underneath that stone-like stump of a tree that he was first confusing with stones, and then when he scraped it off, it was still connected to the whole root system, which made it live underneath still. It's a bit weird. It kind of reminded me of the weirwood trees turning to stone, but I don't know if the stone isn't still magical, hasn't still got the magic of the tree in it.
Well, I'm not sure about the ones that turn to stone, but I know that when we look at the stumps of High Heart, that we do see an instance where there does seem to be some lingering magic associated there. That's kind of why the ghost of High Heart makes her haunt there. She has some sort of connection to it, and it seems to give her the visions, and so she just kind of hangs out there. But those trees were cut down thousands of years ago, and only the stumps remain, and she's still it's
but the stumps,
it's still permeating some sort of magic. So
well, the stumps also have still got the roots, and if they have the roots,
yes,
they can still be connected to the
absolutely.
And they could be like that other tree that the guy found in the book, could be still fed by the other trees to remain, alive, but it doesn't have the trunk and the leaves anymore. But it still could be fed by the rest of the weirwood in the network.
And this goes back to rotting and corrupted yet still somehow alive, right? That the trees are, when they turn to stone, they're kind of in between life and death, right? They're not exactly, they never die, right? Which I think we can take that to mean that the magic of the old gods never dies, right? Unless, of course, the Night's King is going to come and destroy it all.
So what do you
I
think?
don't think the Night's King is that important. It's the Queen that you should worry about. But okay.
All hail, all hail.
So what do you think is powering? Like, I hate to use like that term because it's kind of broad, and but what do you think is powering the Shade of the Evening Tree? Because we do know that the sacrifice, with blood sacrifice, is used for the weirwood tree. We haven't necessarily seen that with the Shade of the Evening Tree. It looks as though the Undying ones were trying to, what she describes as, drain her, and maybe that is how it's done. I'm not 100% sure, but I would like to know, because we don't see that yet, and maybe that's the case, that there are sacrifices to the Shade of the Evening Tree, and I think it would be thematic to do so because they are kind of corrupted, and they'd have to take it from somewhere. So does anybody have any thoughts on where the power of the Shade of the Evening actually derives?
Well,
Does it derive from the stone that fell from the sky? I mean,
it could be fed through the stone, but it also, isn't there a rumor that if you go into the House of the Undying, you might not leave? So maybe because they have like their nightshade grove, like their Shade of Evening grove, and maybe they sacrifice people. We don't know, but it also could leech power from the stone. Definitely, like the black stone, it could definitely leech power of that.
I think there's also a telling line with what Daenerys thinks when she's sort of half in a vision, and then she comes, just as she's about to come out of it with Drogon letting her, it says they wanted her, they needed her, the fire, the life. So, and when she comes to, you've got the one descending on her eye, but you've also got one on her throat, which I think lends a lot of vampiric imagery to the Undying ones, with them sort of like trying to drain her life force. And if we think about what Melisandre does to sort of power the shadow babies, she drains some of Stannis's energy away from his life fires. So I think that is probably what the Undying ones are doing, and they're using that to fuel themselves, which is why, as Jolie pointed out, when I think the entire system of the House of the Undying is to lure people and trap them. Like, it's a maze, it's a labyrinth, it's complete windowless, so there's no direction. And in every single room, they try and provide temptations to the person. Presumably those will be tailored to whoever is in there. So it will be lost family members who you can't wait to reunite with, or it will be your childhood home, or something that you feel that you can't actually give up. I think very few people actually make it to the Undying. They'll end up trapped in some room and consumed, like, as part of this sort of dream vision. But Dany actually manages to make it all the way through and fight, like, to sort of retain her identity. It's only Drogon that manages to sort of save her. She was about to give herself over to them. So I think there's a lot of luring and trying to use one's life force, however generic. There's like the Metachlorians of ASOIAF, just life fires those.
Her chi, right?
You know, I love that. The way that you described it is very similar with, you know, all these rooms trying to trap her and giving her all of these images that of like home and of some of these like more some of them are more disturbing as well, but there are some rooms that are trying to trap her, and that's very reminiscent of the movie The Labyrinth, where she's actually given some illusions of home and of things that are comforting to her in order to trap her as well. So that's pretty cool.
And I think Pirate Pri is surprised to even see her come out. Like, he definitely wasn't expecting her to come out alive. Like, they were definitely luring her in there to kill her and consume her in some fashion. So whatever she had, whatever it was that made Dany important, I don't know if it's like something special about her being royal, king's blood kind of motif, some kind of dragon's blood motif because she's blood of the dragon, or just being a person and having life to consume.
He's probably family, like distant family of the Bloodstone Emperor and the Amethyst Empress. Because if you have the Amethyst Empress and the Bloodstone Emperor were kin, they were brother and sister. And then you have like the amethyst, like Daenerys' eyes are described like amethyst. And then you have like her vision with all her ancestors, which probably are from the Great Empire of the Dawn and not from Valyria. Well, she is from Valyria, but via Valyria, like, she is distantly related to the Great Empire of the Dawn and then the royal family of the Great Empire of the Dawn. I think they could, you know, maybe wanted a new Amethyst Empress to sacrifice to power them, because their power seemed to be less than it was. The dragons revived it a bit, but I think the dragons and the people that are dragon riders and also the people of the Great Empire of the Dawn, the dragon riding families of that, they are connected to the dragons. So it's maybe not especially the dragons, but their blood that is close that makes them, you know, get extra powerful. So I think that maybe they needed her blood or her heart or her life force specifically to remain powerful.
And I think some of the reason that she was able to make it through, right, is that she had the force of will to leave the room, to give up what she allegedly would have gotten, right? So she sees Drogo a lot, you know, and her child, and she sees Rhaegar, right? She's having to give up the possibility of being with her family, even though it wouldn't be real, it would feel real. And so I think a lot of that is her fiery will, right, that of being a Targ. And she's able to kind of overcome, right? And I think also, doesn't she also think of the red door, right? All of these comforting images that she then has to forsake for, you know, for the reason of making it to the end so that she can, you know, get her dragon and Dracarys everyone and get out, right? But I think you are right in that they wanted her, something about her to fuel them. And I think it also shows further that that it's more corrupted because you know, we do have these examples of sacrifice, you know, for the werewood trees, but there is also this hint, kind of like with Nissa Nissa, agony and ecstasy, there's a bit of a hint of sacrifice is more powerful in magic if the person willingly does it, right? And so this lack of consent, they just need the sacrifice. They don't need the willingness. They just need the power, right?
Oh, one thing that I forgot to mention, because I've noticed this in the past, or at least it's like come to my mind in the past, is that the Undying ones obviously are potentially connected to a type of Shade of the Evening analog to the Werewood Net, obviously. And they have consumed enough to where they are blue. So they consume an insane amount of the Shade of the Evening drink. And they're also quite wise because they've been around a long time. They probably have a lot of knowledge. There's kind of the association with knowledge in the trees. And also foresight and seeing the future and the past with the trees. So it is my belief that they may have been trying to entrap her or kill her because they saw their own fate. Because if you're able to do all of that stuff, if you have all that knowledge, if you have premonitions and foresight and are connected to the trees, how could you not see that coming? So I think that the Undying ones probably saw it coming. I don't know if Pyat Pri did, but I think that they were probably trying to change their own fate in that respect. And so, but you can't escape your fate. So it doesn't work out for them. But I do think that they were trying to, in a sense, what they were doing with Daenerys is, you know, not only doing those things, but I think that they also saw what was coming. So that there's that too.
Don't mess with prophecies because it'll bite your prick off every time.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. That's so as part of the way that I'm starting to conceive of A Song of Ice and Fire, I think a huge part of what George is playing with is the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy and how that in and of itself is this sort of tragic component. So the idea that the Undying ones saw their downfall in Dany and was like, I know, let's lure her and kill her. Oh, whoops, we accidentally killed ourselves, is exactly in line with that kind of motif that George, I think, is playing with.
Classic Betty mistake.
Absolutely. I just wanted to throw that in there because I was like, oh, I got to tell them about this. But So
yeah,
yes.
and that's really classic in fantasy trope when you integrate prophecy, which Martin obviously has, which is that the protagonists are trying so hard to fight this fate, they walk just straight into the belly of the beast. And they actually bring on their fate in the process of trying not to, or in trying to avoid that fate, right? So that's a very, very classic trope that I think is definitely in play here.
Cersei. Oh, sorry, what?
Also classic Betty.
And, you know, and on the same theme, I just want to mention that it's not necessarily on subject, but I just want to commend Emma. She did a write-up on Melisandre, and Melisandre is incredibly good at seeing her own fate. And Emma did a really great write-up on who is it, Maester Coleman? Yeah,
Crescent.
Okay. it was Maester Crescent that had planned to poison her. And Emma has this really great post, and it's on your blog site, right?
Yes, it's called A Study in Scarlet. I was so happy with that pun. I'm like, it's a murder mystery, Study in Scarlet, it's Melisandre.
It is excellent. It is so excellent. And she shows all the ways that Melisandre tried to prevent Crescent from coming and coming to the feast, because he came with the intent of poisoning her. And instead of her trying to hurt him right away or imprison him or do anything, you do an excellent job of showing how Melisandre was actually just trying to prevent it. And but you can't escape your own fate. So she obviously survived and he ended up dying, but she was actually trying to help him, which is just, I think is just one of the most, it was a brilliant write-up, and I just wanted to commend you because that discussion reminded me of that.
Thank you so much for the
You're
very,
welcome.
very kind feedback.
Yeah, that's how I feel in grad school. I can't escape my own fate. Well, this is a very sunny note maybe to end on, unless you guys had something else to say. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about what we have going on our respective channels. So I have a couple of essays in the works. I have my first His Dark Materials essay coming out soon about Orientalism in the series, and I'm going to have Lo on, and myself and we're going to talk about Lyson Omar through a queer feminist lens, and that will be very fun. And I'm also going to have on my favorite Cersei stan, Rohan, and we're going to talk about the parallels of Cersei and the Last Empress of China and anything else Rohan wants to regale me with. So that's what I have coming up on my channel. So Crowfood's daughter, what do you have coming up on the Disputed Lands?
Okay, so I promised like a follow-up video for my last video, but I ended up going off on a tangent about maze makers. And so that's going to be my next video, and it's going to be out pretty soon. And I'm really happy with how it's going. And I'm trying to have it out by Saturday. I'm really bad with deadlines, so it might be next week, but I'm going to give it a shot and see how it goes. So if you're interested in the maze makers of Flora, just be looking for that.
Awesome. And she was kind enough to give all of us a preview of that, and it's going to be really good. So I'm excited for that. So Emma, I know you have something really fun for Spooky Month going on right now with the Not So Brave Companions. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I'm currently engaged in potentially the worst writing experience of my life, because I decided to do a deep dive into the Brave Companions because I just hate myself apparently. So I've been uncovering a ton of others related symbolism for them. So far I've released nearly all of them. There's only one essay left, which is Rorge and Biter, and that's at the time of recording, it depends. So that'll be out this weekend at the time of recording, i.e. the 24th. That's the last essay on that. And then for Halloween, I have a extravaganza of Lady Stoneheart analysis, looking at a potentially interesting symbolic connection between Lysa Arryn and Lady Stoneheart, which I'm quite excited to share with everyone.
That is great. And also Archmaester Emma and Crowfood's daughter were on In Deep Geek in this last couple of months. And so Emma, you were talking about Broken Men, correct? And then, yes, and then we had Amanda talking about Patchface. So if you want to know a lot more about the drowned god and these kind of underwater kind of things, she gets into that really well in that. All right, Night's Queen, Jolie, what's going on with you?
Well, I'm kind of stuck because I'm thinking about the curtain of light around the heart of winter. I think there's a symbolic thing there with the long night and all that. So, but I'm kind of stuck. So as soon as I, get unstuck, I will upload a new video. But until then, I have two videos, like the two theories that I really wanted to get out there, because I was enjoying a lot of other people's theories, but especially with my Night's Queen theory, it was just some theory that I really wanted to get out there, because people came close, but they always veered off at the last moment, and I was like, no, there's like, you take a couple more steps, you can get there, and that is like amazing thing. So basically, the two theories that I currently have are my main things that I think differently than the rest, like the rest of the fandom stuff I have seen. But as soon as I get a new brainwave or something, I will upload a video. But it's not like a lot of content still. So
Great, no problem. I like it. You don't get to it until you've got something that excites you. So, and one of those, so she has her Night's Queen theory, and the other one is the Hammer of the Waters theory that we expanded on here. So that's really exciting. Well, great, everyone. Thank you for listening. All of the links are going to be in the descriptions. So subscribe to Crowfood's Daughter and All Hail the Night's Queen. And of course, follow Archmaester Emma's blog, Red Mice at Play. There's also, she has on there some essays by Bronze Steries. I don't know who this guy is. So also some she also hosts another great content creators content. So thank you very much for listening, and please check out all the blogs and all of the channels, and I will see you next time.